The first thing Admiral Cross did when the alert sounded was look at his second officer and wait for her to tell him it was a sensor malfunction. She didn't. Cross had commanded the Eternal Dominion for 11 years. He had fought border skirmishes in the Vareth Corridor, suppressed 3 colonial uprisings in the Outer Rings, and personally overseen the annexation of 4 pre-spaceflight worlds that the Dominion had decided were better off under Imperial management. He was not a man who startled easily. He was not a man who second-guessed his instruments. But when the display in front of him showed a single vessel dropping out of transit drive at the edge of the Cathara system, inside the Dominion's most heavily fortified deep space perimeter, inside 3 successive rings of automated detection, inside a security corridor that had never once been breached in 60 years of operation, his first instinct was to assume the equipment was lying to him. The equipment was not lying to him. "Single contact," said his sensor chief, a lean Varathi named Specialist Edu, whose voice carried the clip precision of someone reading from a report they are genuinely confused by. Bearing Mark IV, distance 11,000 kilometers from the outer beacon line. It came through the transit corridor without triggering a single proximity alarm, no drive signature on approach, no mass displacement reading. It simply appeared. "Appeared," Cross repeated. "Yes, sir." "Run the identification." "Already running. No match in the registry, no match in the Allied vessel database, no match in the captured vessel archive." Edu paused. "No match in the unknown contact catalog." Cross turned to look at him. The unknown contact catalog contained every vessel profile ever recorded by every intelligence service the Dominion had operated for 2 centuries. It was not a short list. Nothing had ever come back empty from it. "What does it look like?" Cross asked. Edu brought the visual feed onto the main screen. The ship was smaller than Cross had expected, roughly the size of a heavy courier, angular with a profile that suggested function over everything else, no visible weapon arrays, no obvious engine configuration. It sat in space with the particular stillness of something that had arrived exactly where it intended to arrive and was in no hurry about what came next. "It's not doing anything," said his tactical officer. "No," said Cross. "It isn't." He opened a hail on all standard frequencies, no response. He tried the diplomatic channels, nothing. He sent a formal Imperial identification demand on the encrypted military band that every registered vessel in the known galaxy was legally required to monitor. The small ship sat in space and said nothing at all. Cross looked at it for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Get me Grand Admiral Sereth." Grand Admiral Sereth was the highest military authority in the Cathara sector, which meant she was responsible for the security of 47 inhabited systems, 233 billion Imperial citizens, and the single most strategically important transit junction in the eastern reaches of Dominion space. She had held that responsibility for 9 years. She had spent most of those 9 years being quietly bored, because nothing of significance had threatened Cathara sector in longer than anyone could remember. That was over now. She arrived on the Eternal Dominions bridge 14 minutes after Cross's call, reviewed the situation in approximately 90 seconds, and spent the next 6 minutes staring at the small unidentified vessel on the main screen with an expression that Cross had never seen on her face before. It came through the perimeter without triggering anything. She said, "Yes, Admiral." "Our perimeter, the one we spent 40 years and more budget than I care to think about building." "Yes, Admiral." She was quiet for another moment. "Has it communicated at all?" "Nothing. We've tried every standard frequency, every diplomatic band, the emergency channels, and the old pre-unification protocols that nobody's used in 80 years. It hasn't responded to any of them." Sereth folded her hands behind her back, a habit Cross had noticed she defaulted to when she was thinking hard about something she didn't like. "What does it want?" "We don't know." "Why is it just sitting there?" "We don't know that either." She turned to look at him. "What do we know?" Cross considered the question carefully. We know it got through our perimeter without leaving a trace. We know it doesn't match anything in any database we have. We know it's been sitting 11,000 kilometers off our beacon line for 22 minutes without doing anything threatening. He paused. And we know that whatever built it is significantly more advanced than anything we've encountered before. Sareth absorbed this, then she made a decision that Cross would later think about many times in many different contexts, as an example of what good command instinct looks like when everything familiar has been removed. "Don't shoot it," she said. The message came 4 hours later, not on any frequency they had tried, on a channel that hadn't existed in the Eternal Dominions communication architecture until the moment it opened. A channel that their own systems apparently created in real time to receive it, as though the incoming signal had simply instructed their equipment on how to hear it, and their equipment had complied. The message was in perfect Imperial standard, not accented, not translated, not approximated. Perfect, the kind of perfect that comes not from a translation algorithm, but from someone who has spent a long time learning a language until they know it the way they know their own. It said, "We have been watching your empire for a long time. We have something you need to see. Please send one officer, unarmed. We will return them within 6 hours. This is not a threat, it is an invitation." Then it gave a docking coordinate. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was silent for a long time after that. "They want us to send someone aboard?" said Cross. "I read it the same way you did," said Sareth. "That's either the most reasonable thing a potential enemy has ever asked, or the most dangerous." "Yes," said Sareth. "It is." She looked at the small ship on the screen, then she looked at Cross. "You volunteered before I finished the thought." "I was going to," he said. "I know, that's why I'm not stopping you." The inside of the vessel was nothing like what Cross had expected, which meant it was nothing like anything he had a framework for. He had built his mental image from the exterior profile, functional, spare, the aesthetic of something designed purely around capability, and the interior matched that, except that capability turned out to mean something far beyond what the ship's size suggested. The person who met him inside was a woman. Human-looking, which startled him, though he couldn't have explained exactly why, medium height, dark-complexioned, with the particular quality of stillness that Cross associated with people who have been in enough dangerous situations that danger no longer changes their baseline. She was wearing no uniform, he recognized. She carried no visible weapons. She said, "Admiral Cross, thank you for coming. My name is Fenn. I'll explain everything. But I need you to first understand something about what you're standing in." He looked around the cabin, clean surfaces, soft light, equipment he couldn't identify. "What am I standing in?" "The oldest human-built spacecraft currently in operation," she said. "It's 240 years old." Cross was quiet for a moment. The Dominion's oldest active vessel was 60 years old, and it was considered an antique. "That's not possible," he said. "Your species has only been spacefaring for as long as you recorded us," she said. "Yes." She let that sit. "We've known about the Dominion for 260 years, Fenn said. "Your first long-range survey probe passed within scanning distance of our home system when my species was still burning coal for energy. We intercepted the probe's data transmission on the way back to your relay station. It took us 19 years to decode it." She paused. "We are very patient when we decide to be, and very motivated when something motivates us." "You decoded an encrypted Imperial transmission," Cross said, 260 years ago using coal-era technology." "We decoded it eventually," she said. "I said 19 years. He stared at her. "What we read in that transmission," she said, "was a survey report classifying our world as a pre-technological curiosity with no strategic value. We were logged, filed, and forgotten." She said it without bitterness, simply as a statement of fact. That was the most useful thing that ever happened to us." She talked for 2 hours. Cross listened. He listened to the story of a species that had read its own survey report and made a collective decision, not unanimous. Nothing with humans was ever unanimous, but broad enough and sustained enough to function as a civilizational choice to stay invisible until they understood exactly what they were invisible within. They had studied the Dominion, not from the outside, not from intercepted signals and long-range observation, though they had done plenty of that. From the inside. Over 2 centuries they had placed observers, people who looked enough like various Dominion species to pass, augmented carefully, trained exhaustively in positions across the Empire, not spies in the dramatic sense, scholars, listeners, people whose only job was to understand. They understood the Dominion's military doctrine in granular detail. They understood the point defense systems, the fleet communication architecture, the command hierarchy, the strategic priorities, the psychological profiles of senior commanders, the political pressures that shape military decision-making at every level. They understood specifically the Cathara perimeter, every sensor type, every frequency monitored, every detection threshold, every gap. "You built around our gaps," Cross said. "We built around the gaps," Fenn agreed. "Not to attack through them. To show you they existed, because something is coming that will find them on its own, and unlike us, it will not come through them with an invitation." That was the part that changed the quality of the conversation. The Morith. Cross knew the name. Every senior officer in the Dominion knew the name. The Morith were a civilization in the deep outer reaches, beyond the Dominion's current expansion frontier, older than the Empire by a factor that military intelligence had never been comfortable putting a number on, technologically advanced in ways that the Dominion's best analysts described with phrases like qualitatively different and outside current modeling frameworks, which were the phrases that analysts used when they meant, "We don't understand this and we're not sure we can." The official Dominion position on the Morith was that they were a potential long-term strategic concern that did not require immediate action. That position, Fenn told him, was going to look very different in approximately 9 months. "They've been moving," she said. She brought up a display, a star map Cross recognized, overlaid with movement data he had never seen. "Not toward you? Not yet. But the trajectory is consistent and the acceleration profile suggests they're not exploring. They're clearing." "Clearing," Cross said. "Removing obstacles from a path they intend to use." She highlighted 4 systems on the map. These were inhabited. 3 of them were registered Dominion protectorates. Cross looked at the map. He knew all 4 systems. He had received no reports of incidents in any of them, and his mind went back, calculating, in over a year. "We haven't had communication from those systems in 14 months from the first, 8 from the last," said Fenn. "Your communication infrastructure assumed relay failure. It wasn't relay failure." The bridge of the small ship was very quiet. "How long have you known this?" Cross asked. "We confirmed it 7 months ago. We've spent those 7 months deciding what to do about it." "And you decided to tell us." "We decided to help you," she said. "Telling you is the first part." The briefing that Cross delivered to Grand Admiral Sareth 3 hours later was the longest and most difficult of his career. Not because the information was complicated. It was, but Cross was good at delivering complex information clearly. It was difficult because every sentence he said required him to also convey the thing underneath the sentence, which was that everything the Dominion thought it knew about its own security, its own technological superiority, and its own position in the galaxy was less complete than anyone had understood. A species they had surveyed as pre-technological was flying ships 240 years old that could walk through their best perimeter without leaving a footprint. A threat they had classified as a long-term concern had apparently already begun operating inside Dominion space, and the Dominion's intelligence apparatus had filed it as relay failure. Sareth listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cross finished, she was quiet for a long time. "She wants a meeting," Cross said. Full military council. She says she has people, not just herself, a team who can brief our senior staff on what they know about Morith, capabilities, movement patterns, and operational doctrine. She says they've been studying the Morith for 60 years. 60 years, Sareth repeated. They knew about them before we officially acknowledged them as a concern, Cross said. They've been watching them the way they watched us, systematically, patiently, building a picture. And in exchange for this picture, Cross had asked Fenn that question directly in the last 10 minutes before he transferred back to the Eternal Dominion. Her answer had been short enough that he could repeat it word for word. She said, a chair, not a throne, not a veto, not a treaty with 50 clauses. A chair in the room where decisions get made. Humans have been affected by everything this empire has decided for 260 years without ever being in that room. That changes now. Sareth absorbed this. That's a significant ask. It is, Cross said. It's also the most reasonable, significant ask I've ever heard. The council meeting happened aboard a Dominion command station 3 weeks later. Fenn came with 11 others, a mix of people that Cross was only gradually learning to understand. Military strategists, xenobiologists who had spent careers studying the Morith, engineers who had spent careers studying the Dominion, a historian whose specific expertise was the collapse patterns of civilizations that had encountered the Morith in the deep historical record and not survived the encounter. That last person, an older man named Sable, who wore no rank and spoke very quietly, was in Cross's assessment the most important person in the room, because Sable had the historical record. The Morith had not always been at the outer edge of known space. They had been at the center of it once, a long time ago, before the current galactic community had developed into its present shape, and the deep archaeological record, assembled painstakingly from the ruins of civilizations that no longer existed, suggested a pattern. The Morith expanded, they cleared, they paused for periods that lasted centuries, then they expanded again. The pause we're in now, Sable said to a room of senior Dominion admirals and strategists who had gone very still, is the shortest one in the record. They are not resting, they are accelerating. The silence in the room had a particular quality to it. The silence of people who have just had the ground shifted under them and haven't yet decided how to stand on the new surface. One of the admirals, a large decorated officer named Grand Commander Patel, who had a reputation for skepticism of anything that hadn't originated inside the Dominion's own intelligence services, said, "How do we know any of this is accurate? You're asking us to restructure our strategic priorities based on the word of a species that, with respect, we classified as pre-technological 2 centuries ago, and which has apparently spent that time building a covert intelligence apparatus inside our own empire." It was a fair challenge. Cross watched Fenn field it. "You know it's accurate," she said, "because we got into your most secure perimeter without your instruments detecting us, and we're sitting in your most secure facility having a conversation that your protocols should have made impossible, and everything we've told you so far has been verifiable through your own records if you look at them with the question we've given you to ask." She paused. "We didn't come here to ask you to trust us. We came here to show you what trust should be based on. Those are different things." Patel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the briefing materials in front of him. After a moment, he turned to the page on Morith movement patterns and said nothing further. The next 6 months were the most concentrated period of military preparation in Cathara sector history. Cross was at the center of it, which meant he was in meetings for approximately 18 hours of every 24, which meant he was running on insufficient sleep and too much stimulant tea, and the particular focused energy that comes from working on something that genuinely matters with people who are genuinely good at their jobs. The humans, he had stopped thinking of them as the humans fairly quickly and started thinking of them as colleagues, which was a mental adjustment that happened faster than he would have predicted, were extraordinary to work with. Not because they were infallible. They were wrong about things, sometimes significantly, but they were wrong in ways that were immediately visible and immediately corrected, which in Cross's experience was rarer and more valuable than being right. Their intelligence on Morith capabilities was the most detailed external analysis of a potential adversary that the Dominion's military had ever worked with. Not because the humans had better technology for gathering it, though in some respects they did, but because they had been gathering it longer, with more patience, with a framework of historical context that the Dominion's own intelligence services had never developed. They knew how the Morith communicated between fleet elements, a distributed resonance system that had no central node, which meant that conventional communication disruption tactics were useless against it. They knew the Morith's primary weapon systems, and, more importantly, they knew the energy signature that preceded activation, which gave a window of approximately 4 seconds of advance warning before firing. 4 seconds was not a long time, it was long enough. They knew the Morith's formation doctrine, ancient, refined, enormously effective, and built entirely around the assumption that whatever they were engaging had never encountered them before, and had no framework for responding. They've never fought anyone who knew what was coming. Finn told the tactical planning group one evening, 3 months into the preparation. In the entire historical record, every civilization they've engaged has gone into the encounter blind. Their doctrine is built on surprise and incomprehension. Remove those two things, and you have a very different engagement. "You've modeled it," said Cross. "For 40 years, she said. "And?" She looked at him evenly. "And it's not a guaranteed outcome. I want to be clear about that. These are not weak opponents, and there is no magic solution. But an engaged fleet that knows what it's facing, with prepared countermeasures for their primary weapons, using formation doctrine designed around their specific vulnerabilities rather than generic engagement principles." She paused. "The models say it's winnable. Not easily, not without cost, but winnable." The Morith arrived in Cathara sector on a morning that Cross had known was coming for long enough that the knowledge had settled into something almost like calm. Almost. There were 340 Morith vessels. By any historical standard, by any record the Dominion had of previous Morith engagements, that was enough to take a sector. More than enough. The historical record suggested that the Morith had taken entire sectors with fewer. The Dominion fleet waiting for them numbered 412. But 412 ships that had spent 6 months rebuilding their tactical doctrine, recalibrating their weapons systems, drilling specifically against Morith engagement patterns, and working alongside intelligence analysts who had spent 60 years studying exactly how this opponent thought and moved and fought. The Morith came out of deep transit in a formation that had not changed in the historical record in 600 years, because it had never needed to. It was a precise, elegant formation. A compressed sphere of vessels designed to expand outward on contact, enveloping whatever it encountered, leaving no avenue of retreat, maximizing the shock of a confrontation with something that no one had ever previously found a framework for surviving. The first thing that happened when they arrived was not what they expected. Nothing about the next several hours was what they expected. The Dominion fleet did not form a defensive line. It did not attempt to engage at range. It split into 9 formation groups and began moving in a pattern that the Morith tactical systems had no historical precedent for, because it had been designed by people who had studied the Morith tactical systems specifically and built around their blind spots. The 4-second warning signature from Morith primary weapons fired, and the Dominion ships moved before the shot arrived. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. The distributed resonance communication system, which had never been successfully disrupted before, found itself operating against a fleet that had been specifically briefed not to try to disrupt it, and instead to use its predictable patterns as intelligence, which was something it had never been used against before. The Morith adapted. Cross had been told they would. Fenn had been extremely clear in every briefing that the Morith were not a civilization that survived as long as they had by failing to adapt. The preparation was not about creating a set of tricks that would work once. It was about creating a fleet that could respond faster, think more flexibly, and maintain coherence under pressure better than an opponent that had grown accustomed to incomprehension on the other side. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. It was not clean. It was not easy. When Cross reviewed the losses later, 61 Dominion vessels, thousands of people, he sat with that number for a long time in the quiet of his office and did not try to make it mean anything other than what it was. The Morath withdrew with 109 vessels remaining. They had never withdrawn from an engagement in the historical record. Sable, who reviewed the data afterward with the careful attention of someone reading a document they had spent their career trying to understand, said that he believed this was the first time in 600 years they had encountered something that surprised them. "What does that mean for what they do next?" Sareth asked him. "I don't know," he said. "That is genuinely new territory for them and for us." The formal session of the Dominion High Council happened 2 weeks after the engagement, in the great chamber on the Capitol Station where Cross had never expected to stand. He was there because Sareth had insisted on it. Fenn was there because the council had requested her presence, which was itself a thing that would have been structurally impossible 4 months ago, because the council had no mechanism for requesting the presence of a representative from a species that didn't officially exist. They had built one, quickly and somewhat untidily, in the way that institutions build mechanisms when circumstances have outpaced their existing frameworks, but they had built it. The council's presiding officer, a very composed elder statesman named First Voice Orrin, who had been in his position long enough to have seen several things he described as unprecedented, looked at Fenn across the chamber floor with an expression that Cross had learned, over the preceding months, to read as careful recalibration, he said. The Dominion Council formally acknowledges the contribution of the human delegation to the defense of Kethera sector. The scale of that contribution, and the nature of the intelligence that made it possible, will require significant revision of several things we believed we understood about this region of space. He paused. "We are also aware that your people have been present in this region for considerably longer than our records indicate, in ways that our security apparatus failed to detect, and that you possess capabilities our instruments are not currently equipped to assess." Another pause. "That is a conversation the council needs to have in full, and it will, but not today." He looked at her directly. "Today I am told you have a request." "One," said Fenn. "A permanent seat on the Defense Council, advisory capacity with full access to strategic intelligence. No veto on Dominion decisions. We're not asking to govern. We're asking to be present for decisions that affect inhabited space that we also live in." She paused. "We've been affected by this empire's choices for 260 years from outside the room. We'd like to be in the room." The chamber was quiet. "That is not a small request," said Orrin. "No," said Fenn. "It isn't, but consider what we're offering in return, not as a transaction, because this shouldn't be a transaction, but as context. 260 years of observation, 60 years of Morath intelligence, a perimeter penetration capability your security teams will spend years fully understanding, and people who have been studying this region of space with no agenda other than survival and understanding." She let that land. "We don't want power over you. We want a seat at the table where we can use what we know before it's needed, rather than arriving through your perimeter after it already is." Orrin looked at her for a long time. Then he looked around the chamber, at the assembled council members, at the senior military staff, at Grand Admiral Sareth, who met his gaze steadily, and at Cross, who did the same. Then he said, "The council will deliberate." They deliberated for 4 days. Cross spent most of those 4 days not sleeping, which was a habit he had apparently developed permanently over the previous 6 months and was going to need to address eventually. On the morning of the 5th day, Fenn found him in the observation gallery on the upper level of the council station, where he had taken to going when he needed to think in a direction that meetings didn't allow. She stood beside him and looked at the same stretch of stars he had been looking at. "They're going to say yes," she said. "I think so, too," he said. "How do you know?" "Sareth told me last night." "She didn't tell me." She told me because she wanted me to have a night of reasonable sleep before the session. Fenn said. She's that kind of person. Cross looked at her. 260 years? He said. Your people have been out here for 260 years, knowing everything you know, and this is the first time you've made contact. Yes. Why now? Why not 50 years ago or 100? Why wait until the Morith were already moving? She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. We waited until we had something to offer that was clearly worth more than the risk of being wrong about you, she said. We've been watching your empire for a long time. Empires are not always safe to approach. We needed to be confident. And the Morith made you confident? The Morith made the timing clear, she said. We were already confident. We'd been watching Sereth for 3 years. Cross thought about that, about someone watching Sereth for 3 years and deciding based on that observation that the Dominion was worth approaching. He found he was not unsettled by it. He found he was, in a way he hadn't expected, something close to proud, not of himself, but of the person his admiral was and what that meant about the institution she represented. What happens now? He asked. After the yes. We figure out how to do this properly, she said. Everything up to now has been emergency work, fast decisions under pressure. What comes next is slower and more complicated and probably more important. Building something that functions across the long term, not just in a crisis. That's harder, he said. Much harder, she agreed. We're good at the patient work, so I think are you. The session was called an hour later. Cross and Fenn walked into the chamber together, which was not something the protocol guidelines had anticipated, and which nobody moved to stop. First voice Orin called the room to order. He looked out across the assembled council and the gathered staff and the various aides and officials who filled every available seat, and he said what he had to say in the direct, careful way that Cross had come to respect about him over the preceding months. The chair was granted. 1 seat, permanent advisory, with full intelligence access and an open line to the Defense Council's standing sessions. The humans would nominate their own representative. The representative would hold no veto and carry no formal authority over Dominion decisions. They would be present, informed, and heard. It was not everything. It was not nothing. It was the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet because nothing quite like it had existed before. The chamber was loud after that for a long time. Cross stood at the edge of it and watched Fenn receive the formal notification with the same stillness she had brought to the docking bay of the Eternal Dominion on the day this began. He thought about a species that had spent 260 years watching from the outside. He thought about the patience that required, and the discipline, and the particular kind of confidence it takes to wait when waiting is the right choice, and not move until moving is the right choice, and know the difference between the two. He thought about the small ship that had appeared inside the Dominion's best perimeter without disturbing a single alarm, and sat 11,000 kilometers from the beacon line, and waited quietly until someone decided to listen. He thought, we almost didn't send anyone. He thought, that was almost the most expensive decision we never made. Later, after the session closed and the chamber had mostly emptied, Sereth found him in the corridor. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been running hard for a long time and has just, for the first time, allowed herself to consider the possibility that it worked. Not in our records, she said. A private reference, something she had said in the first hour looking at Fenn's ship on the sensor display, when the identification scan came back empty for the 4th time. Not anymore, said Cross. She nodded once. Then she walked on because there was still a great deal of work to do, and Sereth was not a person who stood still when there was work. Cross stayed in the corridor for another moment. Through the viewport at the end of the passage, the stars were steady and numerous and largely unknown. Out there somewhere, 109 Morith vessels were doing the slow, recalibrating work of updating their understanding of what they had encountered. Out there, The historical record was being rewritten by people who had survived an engagement that no one had survived before. And out there, a species that had spent 260 years in patient, deliberate silence was preparing to be, for the first time, openly present in the galaxy it had always lived in. Cross thought that the galaxy was probably not ready for that. He thought it was going to be extraordinary anyway. He went back to work.